Hello and welcome to the YouTube adapted version of my lecture series at Heidelberg University for the master student in infectious diseases. I will talk about the principles of vaccination. I will talk about the history of vaccination and the immune responses required for an efficient vaccine response. I will go through some of the parts again that I've done before on the toll-like receptors, talk about dendritic cell, T cell priming, a little bit about T follicular helper cells, which are very important. Then I will talk about the current platforms used for vaccines, and in the end I will have a section on the vaccines developed for SARS-CoV-2. I really hope this will lead to a little bit more informed discussion about how vaccines work and what type of vaccines and their benefits, but also put vaccination in a more historic perspective. I will also mention in this lecture series the polio vaccine, which was a very important vaccine when it came. So enjoy and educate yourself.
So there are several different general strategies to control infectious diseases, and vaccination is only one of them. But the general strategy that we have talked a lot about in the whole society this spring is to limit transmission. And drinking water purification has in history proven to be one of the most important factors in order to limit transmission of infectious disease. And this has also got to do with the fecal disposal, that there should never be any cross-contamination. Mosquito nets has been really important where we have the malaria and the vector-borne viruses, the arboviruses, and as we have seen this spring, social distancing can also be a very effective measure for preventing spread of infectious diseases. Targeting the food supply is also a second level to make sure that storage and also sterilization, or as it's called with food, pasteurization, has led to almost eradication of a lot of different pathogens that we were plagued by before. Meat inspection and general food inspections is a part of the welfare society, which has proven to be very, very important in limiting infectious disease. When it comes to zoonosis, also vector control. And this can be to eradicate pools of still standing water, to avoid the flea, and the reservoir control is to contain wild animals and vaccinate wild animals against rabies, and also make sure that our domestic animals do not carry pathogens like, for example, bovine tuberculosis. And when all these efforts are in place, on top of that comes the vaccination. And when everything else fails, we have the antibiotics and also the antivirals, and also different treatments against bacterial diseases. One of the large killers in the human history is smallpox. The way to defend against smallpox has traditionally been variolation. Here at the top you see a picture, a scanning electron microscope picture from the Robert Koch Institute of the virus. The virus belongs to a family called orthopox viruses, and they exist in several different species. It's a double-stranded RNA virus. We think that the variola virus, which is giving the smallpox, emerged about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago in Africa. But the earliest historical descriptions of this virus is well before Christ in India. Therefrom, it was imported into China, and it was also spread towards Europe. Variolation is the process through which you inoculate with a small dose of the virus in a way that does not cause a major disease but will give protection. And this method was first used in China and in the Middle East before it was introduced into England. And the Chinese have used a method of intranasal inoculation dating back to the 15th century. They took scabs which were dried out and pulverized and then inoculated by this blowing pipe into the nose that you see in the picture. Also, in the Arab world, there has been described variolations in the 18th and early 19th century. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, which is the wife of the British ambassador in the Ottoman Empire, she lost her brother to smallpox. And while she was with her husband in Turkey, she came across the variolation as it was introduced and publicized in Istanbul by two doctors. And in Istanbul, the variolation was most commonly administered by experienced elderly women. And this was a very dangerous thing to do. Some inoculations gave too much virus or caused the disease. But in 1718, she had a procedure conducted on her 5-year-old son. And when she returned in England, she also variolated her 4-year-old daughter in the presence of physicians of the royal court. And after this, the variolation was a spread practice and it was commonly used. And the disease itself could claim 10 to 20% of the population when there were no variolation. And therefore, this was definitely an improvement, but it's still a very dangerous practice. One of King George III's children died from the practice in 1783. So during the 18th century, it became obvious that a prior infection with the cowpox rendered a person immune to smallpox. Towards the end of the 18th century, there were at least 5 different investigators in England and Germany which successfully tested cowpox vaccine against smallpox on human, but none of them did this in a systematic manner where they challenged their vaccinated subjects. But on May the 14th, 1796, the Jenner tested the hypothesis. Edward Jenner was an English physician and scientist, and he's referred to by the English as the father of immunology. So Jenner inoculated the son of his gardener called James Philip, and he was 8 at the time. One of the revolutionary things that Jenner did was that he didn't actually use an inoculate from the cow itself, but he took it from a milkmaid who had cowpox blisters. She was called Sarah Nelms, and she had gotten it from a cow called Blossom. And the hide of this cow is now hanging in the St. George's Medical School library. So Phillips was the 17th case that was vaccinated. But what was special with James is that he was later on challenged with the real virus. So James' unique contribution was not that he inoculated a few persons with cowpox that had been done before, but that he just proved by subsequent challenges that they were immune to smallpox. This was new. And he also then showed that the source of the virus was not the most important part, but that the inoculate could be transferred from person to person, not just from cattle. So Jenner successfully tested his hypothesis on 23 additional subjects. But already then, there were anti-vaxxers. So the smallpox vaccination of using cowpox was generally mocked, and people thought that you should not use animal material to inoculate humans. And in this picture, you can see that it's actually a satire picture where there are cows coming out of people's arses and people are turning into cows and getting features from the cows. So this was not an uncontroversial method at the time. So now vaccinations have become a success story. We have several preventable diseases, as is listed in the left part of this slide. And on the right part is an illustration of what happens when a vaccine is introduced. So Haemophilus influenza type B, Hib, is a bacteria which was discovered during the influenza epidemic in 1892. And it was actually thought to be the cause of the flu for a while. But it's a gram-negative bacteria. It's facultatively anaerobic, and it causes disease in infants and young children, as you can see on the age in month on the graph. And it causes pneumonia and epiglottis and acute bacterial meningitis, which is very dangerous. And in the early 1990s, the vaccine was introduced, and after that, this disease has almost completely become eradicated. The vaccine is quite expensive compared to the other vaccines, and therefore the coverage in poor countries is still not as good as it should be. So first we are going to talk a little bit about passive immunization, which is actually not vaccination, but it is important in this context since it is the acute alternative to a vaccination. So passive immunization, it is the administration of antibodies. It doesn't give any cellular immunity, it doesn't give any memory, and the half-life of the antibodies, it determines the duration of protection. It works with immunocompromised patients which cannot receive vaccinations for various reasons, but it is expensive to manufacture the antibodies required for the passive immunization. There's also a possibility of serum sickness, which is the body's own reaction against the foreign antibodies. And this is, of course, more of a risk when you give antibodies from a different species and if you give them more than once. As opposed to live immunization, which is then in contrast to the passive immunization, is constituted by vaccines, and they depend on an activation of the recipient's immune system. The induction of antibodies is innate, so endogenous, and this means that the antibodies are all produced by the vaccination recipient's own cells. There is a memory generation, which means that the antibodies produced after the vaccination are still there for a very long time, and that means that the antibodies will be maintained in the body. However, there are certain patients that cannot receive full vaccines, and therefore we will talk a little bit about passive immunization. So here's a small overview over the kind of passive immunizations we have access to. And it is a particularly important treatment for post-exposure prophylaxis. So if there is an immediate risk for disease, the passive immunization is much faster working than the active immunization. The tetanus is a life-threatening disease, and it can be given to persons that have developed the tetanus infection. The diphtheria is also in case of the infection. Gasbrand and botulism can also be given, and all of these bacterial diseases are absolutely life-threatening. The chickenpox, the varicella, can be given to immune-compromised patients in case they're exposed to infection. Rabies is an absolute lifesaver. So the passive immunization for rabies can be given to persons that have been directly exposed before they show any symptoms when it is too late. The hepatitis B can be given as a newborn prophylaxis to babies in case there's a risk of transfer from the mother.